Picture a figure standing at the edge of a forest, half illuminated by moonlight, half swallowed by darkness. This is the Sigma INFJ at the threshold of their own shadow, that vast terrain Jung warned us about, the place where our most potent gifts turn venomous, where our greatest strengths become our most dangerous weapons. The shadow is not evil. It is not some malevolent force lurking in the depths. It is simply everything we have refused to see, everything we have exiled from consciousness, everything we have buried beneath the weight of our carefully constructed identities. And for the Sigma INFJ, that rare archetype of the lone visionary, who walks outside the hierarchies of the social world, the shadow is exceptionally vast, particularly seductive, particularly dangerous. Why? Because the Sigma INFJ has spent a lifetime developing extraordinary capacities for insight, for independence, for seeing through the facades of others. They have cultivated a sovereignty of mind that allows them to stand alone, to refuse the comfort of belonging, to navigate reality by an internal compass that answers to no external authority. But every light casts a shadow. Every strength, when taken to its extreme, becomes a pathology. And the Sigma INFJ, precisely because they are so skilled at operating in the margins, so comfortable with solitude, so adept at psychological insight, can descend into shadow territory without even recognizing they have crossed the line. They can begin to weaponize their gifts. They can mistake their isolation for superiority. They can use their insight not to illuminate but to manipulate, not to connect but to control. This is the dangerous Sigma INFJ shadow, and it reveals itself in 5 unmistakable signs, each one a perversion of a noble quality, each one a warning that the wanderer has lost their way. The first sign is the weaponization of insight, the transformation of understanding into a tool for domination. The healthy Sigma INFJ possesses a rare capacity for psychological penetration. They can read beneath the surface of human behavior, detecting motives, fears, wounds, patterns that others cannot see. This is their gift, their way of navigating a world that often feels opaque and bewildering. But in the shadow, this gift curdles into something darker. The Sigma INFJ begins to use their insight not to understand, but to disarm, not to connect, but to gain advantage. They become the chess master who sees 20 moves ahead, not in service of the game but in service of victory, of proving their superiority, of maintaining control. You see this in the way they speak. Their observations, once offered with empathy, now carry a cutting edge. They reveal truths about others not to help them grow, but to destabilize them, to demonstrate their own superior awareness, to keep others off balance. They drop casual psychological assessments that sound like wisdom, but function as subtle aggression. You do that because you fear abandonment. You cannot tolerate being wrong. You need external validation to feel whole. These may be accurate observations, but in the shadow of Sigma INFJ's mouth, they are not acts of compassion. They are acts of control. Jung spoke of this when he described the danger of inflation, the way the ego can become intoxicated by its own powers. When we discover we have a gift for seeing into the human psyche, there is a terrible temptation to use that gift to elevate ourselves, to position ourselves as the one who knows, the one who sees, the one who understands what others cannot grasp. And for the Sigma INFJ, who already operates outside conventional social structures, who already feels themselves to be different, rare, set apart, this temptation is particularly seductive. They begin to see others not as equals engaged in the same struggle of being human, but as subjects, as puzzles to solve, as territories to map and control. The weaponization of insight also manifests in strategic withholding. The shadow Sigma INFJ becomes acutely aware of what others need from them, emotionally, psychologically, and they use that awareness not to meet those needs but to manipulate them. They offer just enough warmth to keep someone engaged, but never enough to satisfy. They reveal just enough of themselves to create intimacy, but always hold back the core, maintaining an asymmetry of vulnerability that gives them power. They become experts in intermittent reinforcement, that most addictive of psychological patterns, offering connection, and then withdrawing it, creating a dynamic where others are constantly seeking their approval, their presence, their validation. This is not the healthy independence of the Sigma INFJ. This is something far more sinister. It is the use of psychological knowledge as a weapon, the transformation of insight from a tool of healing into a tool of harm. And the most dangerous thing about it is how easily it masquerades as wisdom, as discernment, as the natural consequence of superior understanding. The shadow Sigma INFJ convinces themselves they are simply being truthful, merely refusing to coddle others, and maintaining healthy boundaries. But beneath the rationalizations, something darker is at work. There is the desire to remain above, to stay in control, to use their gifts not in service of connection but in service of separation, of proving again and again that they are the one who sees while others remain blind. The second sign is the descent into misanthropy disguised as discernment, the way contempt for humanity can masquerade as clear-sightedness. The Sigma INFJ naturally perceives the gap between what people say and what they do, between the masks they wear and the truths they hide. This capacity to see through social performance is part of what makes them outsiders, what drives them to the margins, where they can observe without being absorbed into the collective delusion. But in the shadow, this discernment metastasizes into something corrosive. It becomes a blanket condemnation, a settled belief that humanity is fundamentally disappointing, fundamentally shallow, fundamentally unworthy of respect or engagement. The shadow Sigma INFJ begins to view the social world not as a complex tapestry of struggling individuals, but as a theater of fools, a carnival of unconsciousness. They see vanity everywhere, pettiness everywhere, conformity everywhere. And while there is truth in these observations, while the world certainly contains all of these things, the shadow Sigma INFJ makes the fatal error of believing they have transcended these qualities, that they alone have escaped the gravitational pull of ego and delusion. Nietzsche warned of this when he spoke of the danger of staring into the abyss. When you gaze long into an abyss, he wrote, the abyss also gazes into you. The Sigma INFJ, in their commitment to seeing clearly, to refusing comfortable illusions, can become so focused on the darkness in others, that they lose sight of the darkness in themselves. They become the critic who sees every flaw but their own, the judge who holds others to standards they themselves do not meet. Their solitude, once a choice made in service of authenticity, becomes an exile justified by superiority. They are not alone because they choose a different path. They are alone because others are not worthy of their company. This misanthropy reveals itself in the language they use when speaking about humanity. Where once they might have spoken with sadness about the compromises people make, the ways they abandon themselves in pursuit of belonging, now they speak with contempt. They refer to the masses, sheep, and NPCs, language that strips others of their individuality and humanity, reducing complex human beings to categories and stereotypes. They curate their isolation, surrounding themselves only with the rare few who meet their standards, and even then, they maintain a certain distance, a certain reserve, never fully committing because they are always watching for signs of the same shallowness they see everywhere else. The danger here is not just the harm this does to others, but the harm it does to the shadow Sigma INFJ themselves. Misanthropy is a poison that destroys the one who drinks it. It cuts them off from the very connections that might soften their judgments, that might remind them of the complexity and beauty that exists alongside the pettiness and unconsciousness. It creates a feedback loop in which their contempt generates more isolation, and that isolation reinforces their contempt, until they are trapped in a prison of their own making. They are convinced they are free, convinced they are clear-sighted, when in reality they have simply succumbed to one of the oldest and most seductive of shadows. This is the belief that wisdom means standing apart, that clarity means standing above, that consciousness means standing alone, in judgment of a fallen world. The third sign is the martyr complex wrapped in stoicism, the way suffering becomes an identity, a badge of superiority, a proof of depth. The Sigma INFJ naturally carries more than others. They feel more deeply, they see more clearly, they cannot unsee the patterns, injustices and tragedies that others manage to ignore. This is the burden of consciousness, what Jung called the price of individuation. To become conscious is to bear the weight of what you see. But in the shadow this burden transforms into a kind of perverse pride. The shadow Sigma INFJ begins to define themselves by their suffering, to wear it as armor, to use it as evidence of their superiority. They become the martyr who suffers in silence, not out of genuine stoicism, but out of a need to be seen as the one who can bear what others cannot. You recognize this shadow trait in the way they speak about their struggles. There is always a subtext of comparison, an implicit message that their pain is deeper, their challenge is more complex, their endurance more impressive than what others face. They describe their solitude as if it were a noble sacrifice, rather than a choice. They frame their emotional restraint as strength, while subtly suggesting that others who express their feelings are weak, are indulgent, or are less evolved. They position themselves as the one who carries the weight so others do not have to, but there is something performative in this positioning, something that seeks recognition even as it claims to want none. The martyr complex also manifests as a refusal of help, a denial of vulnerability, and a refusal to admit that they too need support, connection, and relief from the burdens they carry. The shadow Sigma INFJ convinces themselves that to ask for help would be to fail, to show weakness, to descend to the level of those who need others. And so they suffer alone, but their solitude is not the healthy solitude of someone who is genuinely self-sufficient. It is the defensive solitude of someone terrified of being seen as ordinary, as struggling, as human. They would rather collapse under the weight than reach out, because reaching out would mean admitting they are not the exception, not the rare archetype who transcends human limitation, not the lone wolf who needs no pack. There is something deeply tragic about this shadow pattern, because it takes a genuine strength, the capacity to endure difficulty without breaking, and corrupts it into a prison. The shadow Sigma INFJ becomes so invested in their identity, as the one who suffers nobly, endures silently, and needs nothing from anyone, that they cut themselves off from the very resources that might ease their burden. They reject comfort as weakness, they reject connection as dependency, they reject joy as frivolity. And in doing so they trap themselves in a perpetual state of grim endurance. Convinced this is depth, convinced this is wisdom, convinced this is what it means to be truly conscious in an unconscious world. But it is not depth, it is rigidity, it is not wisdom, it is a defense, it is not consciousness. It is the ego's desperate attempt to maintain its specialness, its separateness, its superiority, by claiming a monopoly on suffering and endurance. The fourth sign is the manipulation of mystique, the way the shadow Sigma INFJ uses their enigmatic quality, not as a natural consequence of their complexity, but as a calculated tool for maintaining power and fascination. The healthy Sigma INFJ is genuinely difficult to read. Their inner world is vast, their thoughts layered, their emotions complex and often contradictory. They do not perform their identity for others, because they are too busy living it, exploring it, and trying to understand it themselves. But in the shadow, this natural mystique becomes weaponized. It becomes a strategy, a way of keeping others hooked, a way of maintaining the upper hand in every interaction. The shadow Sigma INFJ becomes acutely aware of how their inscrutability affects others. They notice how their silence creates curiosity, how their emotional restraint makes others work harder to reach them, and how their unpredictability keeps people off balance and therefore engaged. And once they notice this, they begin to cultivate it, to perform it, to use it as a form of control. They reveal themselves in carefully measured doses, always holding back just enough to keep others guessing, always maintaining an air of mystery that positions them as the prize to be won, the puzzle to be solved, the depth that others can approach but never fully access. You see this in the way they communicate. Their responses are deliberately vague, open to multiple interpretations, designed to make others wonder what they really mean, what they really feel, whether they really care. They drop hints about depths they will not fully explain. They allude to experiences they will not share. They speak in metaphors and abstractions that sound profound but reveal nothing concrete. This is not the natural complexity of the Sigma INFJ trying to express something genuinely difficult to articulate. This is performance, calculation, strategy. The mystique also functions as a defense against genuine intimacy. As long as they remain mysterious, as long as they maintain this carefully constructed enigma, they never have to show themselves fully, never have to risk being truly seen, and possibly found wanting. They can bask in others' fascination, while never offering the vulnerability that real connection requires. They become addicted to being pursued, to being wondered about, to being the object of others' fascination, because this dynamic keeps them in control, keeps them safe, keeps them positioned as the rare and valuable one, while others remain on the outside looking in. Plato's cave comes to mind here, but with a twist. The shadow Sigma INFJ is not the philosopher who returns to the cave to free the prisoners. They are the one who stands at the cave's entrance, half in light and half in shadow, allowing others to see just enough to know there is something beyond, but never enough to make the journey themselves. They become the gatekeepers to depths they claim to possess. Still, those depths become increasingly hollow, because they are no longer being explored in genuine solitude, but performed for an audience, maintained not for their own sake, but for the power they confer. This is perhaps one of the most insidious shadows, because it so closely resembles the genuine quality it corrupts. The line between natural complexity and performed mystique is razor-thin, and the shadow Sigma INFJ can cross it without even realizing. They tell themselves they are simply being authentic, simply refusing to cheapen their inner world by making it too accessible, simply maintaining appropriate boundaries. But beneath these rationalizations, something calculated is happening. Something that treats relationships as games, others as audiences, and their own complexity not as something to be genuinely explored, but as a resource to be strategically deployed, in service of remaining untouchable, unfathomable, and therefore perpetually in control. The fifth and perhaps most dangerous sign is the corruption of autonomy into isolation, fueled by fear, in which independence becomes a fortress, solitude becomes a hiding place, and the refusal of belonging becomes a refusal of life itself. The Sigma INFJ's autonomy is their birthright, their natural state. They do not need external validation to know their worth. They do not need social hierarchies to give them position. They do not need to belong to know they have value. This is their power, their gift, their freedom. But in the shadow, this autonomy curdles into something far more desperate and defensive. It becomes not a choice but a compulsion, not freedom but imprisonment, not strength but terror, masked as strength. The shadow Sigma INFJ begins to use their independence as a shield against the fundamental vulnerability of being human, against the terrifying truth that we all need connection, that we all need to be seen, that we all need to belong, even if we choose to belong in unconventional ways. They convince themselves that their isolation is chosen, is preferred, is a sign of their evolution beyond the needs that drive ordinary people. But beneath this conviction there is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood. fear of offering themselves and being found insufficient, fear that if they truly let someone in, they will discover they are not as rare, as deep, as exceptional as they have believed. And so they preemptively reject before they can be rejected. They withdraw before they can be abandoned. They maintain their autonomy at all costs, because the alternative, genuine interdependence, feels like annihilation. This shadow manifests in an inability to commit, to invest fully, to allow themselves to need anyone or anything. They keep one foot always out the door. They maintain escape routes from every relationship. They cultivate alternatives to every connection, so they are never dependent on any single person or community. This seems like wisdom, like healthy boundary maintenance, like the natural caution of someone who has been burned before. But it is not caution. It is paralysis. It is the terror of being human, of being vulnerable, of entering the arena of genuine relationship, where you cannot control how you are seen, where you cannot predict how things will unfold, where you might be hurt, disappointed, misunderstood, or simply discovered to be less extraordinary than you hoped. Jung said that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate what seems important to you. The shadow Sigma INFJ experiences this loneliness acutely. Still, instead of taking the risk of genuine communication, of genuine vulnerability, they convince themselves that the loneliness is proof of their uniqueness, proof that they are too different, too deep, too evolved for ordinary connection. They turn their wound into their identity, their fear into their philosophy, their isolation into their achievement. And the most heartbreaking thing about this shadow is that it takes the Sigma INFJ's greatest strength, their capacity for independence, and transforms it into the very thing that ensures they will never have what some part of them desperately wants: genuine connection, genuine intimacy, genuine belonging with people who see them fully and love them anyway. They become so skilled at self-sufficiency that they forget how to receive. They become so comfortable with solitude that they lose the capacity for companionship. They become so defended against the pain of rejection that they reject themselves, exiling themselves to a life of noble isolation that is really just fear wearing a crown. This is the ultimate danger of the Sigma INFJ shadow, not that they will harm others, though they may, but that they will harm themselves, condemning themselves to a life of perpetual distance, perpetual guardedness, perpetual refusal of the very connections that might soften their sharp edges, that might remind them they are not the lone wolf prowling the wilderness but simply a human being who, like all human beings, needs to be seen, needs to be held, needs to know they belong somewhere to someone, even if that belonging looks nothing like the conventional forms they have spent their lives rejecting. These 5 signs, weaponized insight, misanthropic superiority, martyred stoicism, calculated mystique, and isolated autonomy, are not separate afflictions, but aspects of a single shadow constellation, a pattern that emerges when the Sigma INFJ's greatest gifts turn against them, when their strengths become their prison, when their outsider identity becomes not a chosen path, but an exile they can no longer escape. The question is not whether you recognize these shadows, because if you have truly walked the Sigma INFJ path, you have at least glimpsed them, at least felt their pull, at least understood their seductive logic. The question is what you do with that recognition. Do you turn away, telling yourself these shadows belong to others, that you are too aware, too conscious, too evolved to fall into these traps? Or do you have the courage to look directly at your own reflection in these descriptions, to ask yourself honestly where you have weaponized your gifts, where you have used your clarity as a weapon, where you have worn your suffering as a badge, where you have hidden behind your autonomy, because genuine connection felt too dangerous, too vulnerable, too likely to reveal that you are not the exception you have needed to believe you are, but simply another human being struggling to find their way in the dark, trying to balance the need for authenticity with the need for belonging, walking the knife edge between solitude and isolation, between independence and loneliness, between seeing. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the teacher. It is everything you have refused to integrate, everything you have exiled because it threatened the story you tell about yourself. And for the Sigma INFJ, whose story so often centers on being rare, being different, being the one who sees what others miss. The shadow contains all the ordinary human needs and fears they have tried to transcend, all the vulnerability they have been attempting to armor against, all the longing for connection they have convinced themselves they do not feel. To face the shadow is to admit you are not above the human condition, but fully immersed in it, not separate from others, but connected to them in your shared struggle. Not the wanderer who needs no path, but a traveler who, like everyone else, is trying to find their way home.